Hi there folks, this is Dan Dix here from Press for Truth. And today I felt the need to put out this video in response to some of the reactions that I've been getting lately to my Ottawa shooting videos, and the fact that we here at Press for Truth are still in the process of investigating whether this was a false flag operation or not. Now, the problem with calling the Ottawa shooting a false flag is that we need to define what a false flag actually is. If I knew an individual was going to attack but failed to do anything about it, does that constitute a false flag? Or must I be actively involved with making sure that the attacks take place? The problem with the Ottawa shooting is that at this point, you can't really prove if it's a Gladio operation or not. The job of the CIA and these top secret Pentagon programs is to cover up conspiracies. All we can do is assess the information that has come out and look for holes in the official story. Now, it's pointless to divide the issue on whether this was a false flag or not. Whether the Ottawa shooter was a lone gunman or a pawn in a larger conspiracy, well, it led to the same conclusion: the destruction of our liberty. The Ottawa shooter and the man who ran over 2 soldiers in Quebec have produced the same responses from our establishment media and politicians, regardless of whether or not they were acting alone. And this is part of the problem with media in this day and age. We can't even trust the most basic information coming out from the establishment. Even the most basic information. Just think about that. And it's not just the mainstream media, folks. I've been getting messages over and over to report this as a Gladio-influenced false flag operation. Well, I'm not going to report on something unless I know it's 100% truth. And really, I could claim any event was staged by Gladio if the only basis for evidence is that nobody has proved that it isn't. So then what did happen in Ottawa? Well, a soldier was killed. Nathan Cirillo was a real man, a father of a 7-year-old son. The internet trolls claiming that this man never existed and that this event is a giant media hoax, well, they need to step away from their keyboards. I understand the fear, the frustration, and absolute dishonesty that does come from the establishment. These are certainly strange times, but I can assure you this event actually did happen. 2 soldiers are dead. One of them a 24-year-old reservist. This isn't a made-up story, nor was Nathan a made-up person. And frankly, some of the comments that I'm seeing on the internet regarding this event are just downright disrespectful. I understand how the media lies, how corrupt governments are, and how false flags are used to drum up support of the masses. And it's quite obvious to me that the establishment is using this event for their own ends. But we have to remember that it is in the elite's interest to promote false conspiracies, poisoning the well, as it were. We know the CIA is active in the mainstream media, and it certainly doesn't take a huge stretch of the imagination to think that the internet has been compromised as well. That those YouTube videos calling this attack in Ottawa a staged hoax, well, that requires a leap of faith and logic. Canada isn't America. Even though a lot of Canadians are in the dark about a lot of stuff, our education system hasn't taken the abuse that we have seen just south of the 49th parallel. It's common knowledge in Canada, and probably across the world, that Americans have been purposefully dumbed down. We all have, really, but especially in America, the last beacon of hope for the free world. The attacks on civil liberties and on intelligence has been the strongest in the land of the free. Therefore, pulling off a staged false flag scenario is relatively easier to do in the United States. Here in Canada, we're just too small a country. Too many journalists still believe they're doing good. Just look at the coverage from the CBC of the Ottawa shooting compared to Fox News or MSNBC. Now, even though our media is controlled for power elite purposes, it certainly isn't as bad as Operation Mockingbird. Again, while the entire world is enslaved by international bankers, it is in the United States of America where this onslaught of a dwindling of intelligence, false flag events, poisoning of the food, water, and skies has been the strongest. It happens in Canada, but to the extent that the authorities can get away with staging an event with crisis actors, well, we may be getting close, but Canada isn't quite there yet. So what did happen in Ottawa then? What are the holes in the official story? Well, first there's the fact that the American media had information on the shooter before Canadians did. I can think of a few reasons that this may be. One, the American media is certainly more equipped than their Canadian counterparts. Not only do they have more updated equipment and better technology, but they also have a better means of getting the information that they need, whether that be through their contacts in the FBI or the CIA. The American media has also been dealing with secretive governments much longer than we have. Harper's veil of secrecy, like his attack ads and 24/7 campaigning, were picked up from the American politics. The American media are used to dealing with secrecy and getting information that they need. Us Canadians are still relatively new to this idea. A super secret government must be hiding information for a good reason, right? I wonder how many Canadian journalists didn't press for the shooter's identity for supposed national security concerns given by the Harper government. The very same concerns that wouldn't even faze the American media machine. Now this brings up the Canadian coverage of the event. A lot of Canadian outlets, particularly the CBC, refused to speculate until all the facts were confirmed. A rather refreshing change from how they usually respond, and especially when compared to the American coverage that I've been seeing. It makes sense though, with all the major news outlets tuned into Ottawa, the incentive to keep Canadians watching Canadian coverage meant doing something that the Americans weren't, giving a non-sensational account of what happened. Now, that certainly doesn't vindicate our media establishment. In fact, in the days since, no one has questioned whether continually bombing overseas and more police state measures right here at home will really fix anything. In fact, rather than take the somber approach that they took on Wednesday, October 22nd, the Canadian media have reverted back to parroting the establishment line. They're on board with the Harper government, calling these attacks an act of terrorism, despite how only military personnel have been targeted. Now, I'm not trying to justify the actions of these attackers. In fact, doing so may end me in jail, thanks to new police state legislation. No, I don't condone these attacks in any way whatsoever. But I'm certainly not going to just turn a blind eye to their motivations, assuming these men were acting alone. Now, the RCMP does infiltrate various groups. We have seen this. Now, whether a couple of Gladio operatives head any of these cells is, of course, a question that needs to be asked and needs to be answered. But the RCMP does track potential attackers. In the case of these recent attacks, they wanted to go overseas, but the RCMP revoked one of their passports. Why would they do that? It should be obvious to anyone that if someone has ISIS sympathies and they want to go fight for them, but they're prevented from leaving their home country, well then the attack on that home country is going to increase by tenfold. So either the RCMP were waiting for this to happen, or their organization is so bureaucratic that it needs to be abolished, and no amount of funding will ever fix this kind of stupidity. And now the RCMP are complaining that they can't even arrest a man for having radical thoughts, but they can make him a prisoner of his own country. They can incentive him to attack in Canada by removing his ability to travel to the Middle East. This is either criminal negligence or just plain criminal. Either way, the solution has been to give more police powers and take away more of our rights. See, in the real world, if you're running a business and you mess up, like royally mess up, where you mess up so bad that people die, well, that kind of mess up requires bankruptcy. So what happened to the RCMP and our spying agencies since last Monday and Wednesday's attacks? Well, they've been given more power and more funding. And the definition of insanity is, there are questions that still remain about what took place in Ottawa. But right now, patience is a virtue. I could get on here and say, false flag 100%, Operation Gladio for sure, and even speculate on whether Nathan Cirillo was a real person. But that's not investigative journalism. That is confirming your bias. Just as state lovers take everything Obama says on his word, there are people in our movement that will, sad to say, watch a couple of YouTube videos and suddenly they're enlightened. Take, for example, the last shooting in Canada in Moncton, New Brunswick, where an individual shot dead 3 RCMP officers. Do you know how many videos there are online saying that this was a staged hoax? That the killer isn't real and that everyone involved was a crisis actor? Now, don't get me wrong, it's good to have an open mind, but don't keep it so open that your brain falls out. Well, then you may be asking, how did he get into the Parliament buildings with all that security? Well, remember, just moments earlier, he fired a gun 300 yards away. This was the distraction that kept everyone's attention at the War Memorial while he ran up to the Parliament building. And since Parliament security isn't used to having guys just walk in with shotguns, it probably took them a second or two to realize what was happening. Of course, there are CCTVs all over the property, including inside the building, so eventually this footage will get released. But again, patience. Access to information requests can take up to months, unfortunately. So if you want to call the Ottawa shooting a false flag, I think that term could be appropriate. 2 psychos went and murdered some innocent people. One of them has ISIS sympathies, but also clearly had a chemical imbalance. When one of them attacked Parliament, the powers that be saw the opportunity to exploit this as a terrorist attack. That is where the false flag terminology can be used if you so desire. A deranged coward shot dead an unarmed soldier and then stormed the Parliament building. We're told that this was an ISIS attack and that we need to give up our liberties for safety and just continue to bomb the Middle East. The truth is that even if politically motivated, these actions weren't an attack from ISIS. They were the product of a failed system right here at home. An education system that indoctrinates individuals and destroys their creativity. A healthcare system that isn't equipped to properly deal with these kinds of mental health issues. A financial system that keeps the rich rich and enslaves the rest of us under perpetual debt. A police state system that treats failure as a means to more funding and power. And a government system that demands the regulation of individual free will. Which begs the question, why even issue passports? Clearly these men wanted to leave the country and go fight overseas. Since when did you have to apply for government papers just to leave the country? See, Western nations are already well on the road to tyranny. And even though I can't prove 100% that this wasn't a Gladio operation, the fact is there is no reason why it needed to be. Crazy stuff like this happens without the need for a conspiracy. Other than the conspiracy to take our liberties, of course. And in Canada, it was only a matter of time. Whether they let it happen or not is a topic that we will continue to research, just as we continue to research 9/11 13 years later. But it should be obvious that no matter where you stand, false flag or not, the end result is always the same. More tyranny and less liberty. And that is the trend that needs to be reversed. So thanks for tuning in today, folks. If you haven't seen any of my previous videos on the Ottawa shooting, be sure to check the links in the description. And also be sure to follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, as we will have more video reports coming very soon from pressfortruth.ca.